Kilcoursey, the Unsolved Murder of Father Niall Molloy. On the evening of Sunday, the 7th of July, 1985, three good friends, Richard Flynn, his wife Teresa, and Father Niall Molloy shared drinks together in the master bedroom of the Flynn's home, Kilcoursey House, just outside Clara, County Offaly. Before sunrise the following morning, Father Niall Molloy would lie dead. The culprit made a full admission. However, the Molloy family's 40-year search for truth and justice had only just begun. In this episode, the SCRT finally concludes its investigation and submits its report. However, a senior counsel is appointed to review the SCRT's examination of the original Garda investigation. Episode 7: The McGinn Report. By mid-November 2012, the SCRT had been reviewing Father Niall's case for 2 years. While the SCRT conducted the review, the public were not updated on their progress, as is customary when an investigation is ongoing. Frustration began to show with the pace of the investigation and a perceived lack of progress. Public appeals for an independent inquiry started to surface again. The Labour Senator for Roscommon, John Kelly, reminded the Seanad of the promise his party and Fine Gael had made when they were in opposition. He was calling on the government to keep their word and establish an independent inquiry into Father Niall's death. He addressed the Seanad. Prior to the general election, Fine Gael and Labour pledged to establish a commission of inquiry into his brutal murder, and this must be honoured. Describing Father Niall's case as being the biggest cover-up in the history of the state, Senator Kelly told the Seanad, "When something looks and smells like a rotten apple, it certainly is a rotten apple. This man was left to die for up to 6 hours following a wedding in Clara." Senator Kelly also reminded the Seanad, "Father Molloy's father was a senator in this house. I think we ought to give him justice." He added, "Any inquiry must be independent. We cannot have the Gardaí investigating other Gardaí." Labour Senator for Laois Offaly, John Whelan, supported Senator Kelly's calls for an inquiry. Senator Whelan called on the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, to fulfil a commitment given to the Molloy family prior to the general election. Senator Whelan continued, "The culprits, those responsible for the murder of Father Niall Molloy, are walking free." 4 more senators would also voice their support for an independent inquiry. They also called for the Minister for Justice to come before the House to answer the serious allegations of a botched inquiry and cover-up. Just a few days after senators and the Seanad called for an independent inquiry, the Sunday Times published an article. The information for the article was leaked to the Sunday Times by an anonymous source within the Gardaí. The article would claim that the SCRT, during their review, had found no evidence to support allegations of a cover-up by Gardaí, politicians or judges. The following day, on the 19th of November 2012, an article by Gemma O'Doherty was published in the Irish Independent in reaction to these leaked findings from the SCRT's investigation. Gemma asked the Molloy family for their reaction. They would tell Gemma that they were disgusted but not surprised by claims of there being no cover-up. As a result, the Molloys would reach out to the office of the Garda Ombudsman asking why the story leaked to the Sunday Times and who had leaked it. They wouldn't get any satisfactory answers. Gemma also interviewed a retired member of the Gardaí for his reaction, retired Detective Inspector Jerry O'Carroll. In the 1980s, Detective O'Carroll had been attached to Garda headquarters in the Phoenix Park, working in the Garda Central Detective Unit. After Richard Flynn was acquitted in 1986, Detective O'Carroll conducted his own investigation into the circumstances of Father Niall's death. He described to Gemma how the Gardaí tried to intimidate him to stop looking into Father Niall's case. The Phoenix Park tried to silence me when I got vital evidence about the case and attempted to investigate it myself. He would recall on one occasion, 2 superintendents came in and searched my office. I told them then nobody would silence me. When I joined the Guards, I swore an oath of office that I would do my work without fear, favour, malice or ill will. Detective O'Carroll had over a long career investigated many murder cases, but stated that the Molloy case is the only one that I can put my hand on my heart and say there was a massive cover-up. Gemma contacted Senator John Whelan, representing Laois Offaly, for comment. He again called on the Minister for Justice to honour his promise and grant an independent inquiry into the circumstances of Father Niall's death. Faith had now totally diminished in the abilities of the SCRT, especially in view of the leaked conclusion of there being no cover-up. Senator Whelan told Gemma that the reported contention by the Gardaí that there is no evidence of any cover-up in relation to the Father Molloy case is hugely disappointing, but hardly surprising. It only serves to underscore the urgent need for an independent inquiry into this disturbing case, and highlights once more the deficit of credibility of the Gardaí authorities investigating themselves. As a result, he felt that this is not in the interest of the force and its many committed and dedicated officers who I am sure also want to see justice served. Senator Whelan also explained that he felt that if the cold case investigations is now concluded, then there is no other resource to restore the confidence in the institutions of the state and ensure justice for Father Molloy, his family and the community at large, than for Minister Shatter to establish, as promised, a commission of inquiry into this whole sordid affair. Detective Jerry O'Carroll gained notoriety in the 1980s by being a member of the Garda Central Detective Unit, otherwise known as the Murder Squad. The Murder Squad consisted of Dublin-based Detective Gardaí who were dispatched to investigate murders and serious crimes committed anywhere in the state. They prided themselves in their ability to extract confessions from suspects, boasting of securing a high prosecution rate. The Kerry Babies case in 1984 led to the Murder Squad being disbanded and the formation of a public tribunal. Detective O'Carroll and 3 of his colleagues would be demoted to desk duties as a result of their mishandling of the Kerry Babies case. While serving at a desk, Detective O'Carroll would claim he came into confidential information in relation to Father Niall's case, which triggered him to conduct an investigation of his own. After being quoted in Gemma O'Doherty's article in the Irish Independent in November 2012, the SCRT invited now-retired Detective Inspector O'Carroll to be interviewed, and he provided them with a statement. He began by telling the SCRT that the week after Richard Flynn was acquitted in 1986, he received some information in relation to Father Niall's case and the Flynn's GP, Dr. Dan O'Sullivan, from a highly respected and trusted source. Detective O'Carroll's source told him that after Father Niall's death, Dr. O'Sullivan confided in a medical colleague that he had witnessed some awful and dreadful events at Kilcoursey House the night Father Niall died. According to the source, Dr. O'Sullivan was distraught and close to a nervous breakdown. Detective O'Carroll was told that Dr. O'Sullivan had apparently also confided in his colleague that Father Niall's genital area had been mutilated, and as a result, there was blood everywhere. The source suggested that he examine the post-mortem photos of Father Niall. He claimed the photos would prove that there was mutilation to Father Niall's body, and they would help explain the mystery of the 8-foot-long bloody drag mark on the carpet. Detective O'Carroll recalled that in June 1986 he was approached by the Dublin TD Liam Skelly. Deputy Skelly explained to him that he had met with Ian Maher on behalf of the Molloy family to hear the concerns the Molloys had in relation to Father Niall's case. After they spoke, Detective O'Carroll agreed to work with Deputy Skelly, and together they would discreetly look into the case. They travelled to Castlerea, County Roscommon, to interview William Molloy's wife, Carmel. Father Niall had confided in Carmel about the break-in at his home before he died. Carmel handed over Father Niall's watch to Detective O'Carroll, who told the SCRT he saw that the glass on the face of the watch was broken and its hands were stopped at 10:40. Detective O'Carroll then brought the watch to a professional watchmaker in a jeweller's in Castlerea. The watchmaker explained to Detective O'Carroll that the watch had special toughened glass and was almost indestructible. The watchmaker was of the opinion that the glass face could not have been broken in a fall. Instead, it was most likely broken by being struck by an object with great force. The watchmaker would be approached by the SCRT, and he provided a statement in December 2012. He would tell the Gardaí that a few months after Father Niall was killed, he remembered William Molloy bringing in a Swiss mechanical gold watch for repair. He observed the cracked glass had pressed against the hand, stopping the watch. The watchmaker told the SCRT he replaced the glass face with mineral glass, which only cost £5 or £10. He said that the damage could have been caused by letting the watch fall on a hard surface or by striking it accidentally against a hard object, and not necessarily as a result of a severe blow. According to the watchmaker, William Molloy was the only person to bring the watch into his repair shop. He told the SCRT he was never shown the watch by any member of the Gardaí. Also, as part of his investigation, the retired detective would tell the SCRT that he had called to see Father Dignan in Clara in 1986. He remembered that Father Dignan was surprised by the visit. According to Detective O'Carroll, Father Dignan became quite agitated and stated that his conscience was clear. As far as Father Dignan was concerned, it was all over and he had nothing to say. Following up on his source's suggestion of examining the post-mortem photos, Detective O'Carroll approached the Garda Technical Bureau photographer, who gave him copies of the crime scene photos taken in Kilcoursey House. Detective O'Carroll explained that he had also managed to separately obtain a copy of the photographs taken during Father Niall's post-mortem. Once in possession of both sets of photos, he then concluded his investigations as he found no evidence of any mutilation to Father Niall's genital area. He would state in his report, "Having examined the photos, I concluded that the information in my possession was inaccurate and appeared not to warrant further investigations." Not long after he got copies of the photos, Detective O'Carroll recalled being approached by two senior Gardaí who demanded their return, and which he duly handed over. He told the SCRT that he became concerned that he had become the subject of an investigation because he had been looking into Father Niall's case. He asked the senior Gardaí what he should do with the information that he had gathered during his investigation. Retired Chief Superintendent Thomas Burns would tell the SCRT he instructed Detective O'Carroll to furnish any such information to the coroner in advance of Father Niall's inquest and to submit a formal report to his superiors. Detective O'Carroll's report, with conclusions, would be submitted to Assistant Commissioner David Leahy on the 14th of July 1986, just 10 days before Father Niall's inquest. Its contents would not be made public. The investigation and report were not brought up at Father Niall's inquest. After his fall from grace due to his involvement in the Kerry Babies case, Detective O'Carroll would eventually revive his career. Within a few years, he would be promoted from desk duties to Detective Inspector. By 1988, Detective Inspector O'Carroll was heading up the Tango Squad, the nickname for the special surveillance unit established to watch the General, Martin Cahill, 24/7. A further article by Gemma O'Doherty, published in the Irish Independent on the 22nd of November 2012, claimed in its title, "Truth about Father Molloy's murder will rock the state." Gemma's piece reported on the scenes in the Seanad a week before. She recounted how Senator Kelly described Father Niall's case as the biggest cover-up in the history of the state. Gemma would write, "A 2-year investigation by this newspaper into the priest's killing had exposed a litany of damning evidence and glaring inconsistencies which point to nothing less than a cover-up of staggering proportions involving several institutions of the state and the Catholic Church." She went on to claim that when the full facts are finally brought into the public domain, they will rock the foundations of the state. In her article, Gemma explained that as part of the Irish Independent's investigation, dozens of individuals were interviewed. From their testimonies, Gemma gleaned what she described as a catalogue of shocking revelations. These included claims that a senior Fianna Fáil politician had been present in Kilcoursey House the night Father Niall was killed. She would also make claims that evidence was contaminated. Gemma pointed out that the Gardaí in the original investigation either took bizarre statements or neglected to interview key witnesses completely. As a result, she stated that the original Garda investigation was botched and shambolic. Gemma also called out the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, for his promises to establish an inquiry into Father Niall's death if his party came to power, which it had. In her article, Gemma went on to criticise the SCRT review as its pace had been shamefully slow and nothing less than mystifying at times. She described the 2-year investigation as leaving the Molloy family utterly disillusioned. Gemma also wrote of the concern people in the Midlands seemed to feel as there appeared to be no urgency to take a violent killer off our streets or hold those responsible for the subsequent cover-up to account. In concluding, Gemma again called on the Minister for Justice to grant an independent judicial inquiry. She felt the time is long overdue for him, the Minister for Justice, to grant this, not only because justice must be delivered for the family, but because the public that the Minister serves have a right to know the truth, however shocking it will turn out to be. The SCRT continued to interview key witnesses throughout December 2012. On the 5th of December 2012, Liam Lycett, former solicitor to the Flynn family, would volunteer a statement. He confirmed that he and his staff consulted with and prepared the statements of the members of the Flynn family back in 1985. As to whether or not there was any evidence that Father Niall and Teresa were business partners, Liam told the SCRT that there had been some confusion over the issue. He accepted he had represented them both in one proposed land deal, but the deal had not gone ahead. When asked, he claimed that he was unaware of any relationship between the Flynns and Justice Frank Rowe. Liam recalled that by the time he arrived at Kilcoursey House at 7:30 a.m. on Monday, the 8th of July, 1985, Richard had already confessed to having struck Father Niall. He remembered being told that there had been an argument over drinks and something about going away on holidays. Liam claimed that photographs of Richard's injuries had been taken at the time. He also asserted that Richard sought medical treatment for his injuries, which Dr. O'Sullivan had confirmed. Liam told the SCRT he knew there was a bloody drag mark across the bedroom floor. He explained that Richard at that time had told him that he began to drag Father Niall across the bedroom, but then thought better of it and stopped. Liam Lycett stated that there was no suggestion whatsoever that anyone other than Richard had been involved in Father Niall's death. He told the Gardaí that he believed Richard Flynn would not have confessed to a crime unless he had committed it. A few days before Christmas, on the 19th of December 2012, David Flynn agreed to speak to the SCRT for a second time. David would meet with Detective Superintendent McGinn, who hoped to clarify some aspects of the case with him. He would tell the Detective Superintendent that even though he had sought legal advice both back in 1985 and before meeting the SCRT, he was still willing to speak with him. David said that despite not knowing before, he could now give an explanation as to what had happened to the coffee table. He stated that a 20-year-old guest at the wedding broke the table either on the day of the wedding or just after it. David said his sister Maureen still had the coffee table. David would admit that his father had at the time explained to him how the bloody drag mark on the bedroom carpet came about. Richard confided in David that he had dragged Father Niall's body away from the bed. David then went on to discuss his mother's relationship with Father Niall, telling Detective Superintendent McGinn that it contained a lot of background. He claimed that no one really knew what their business actually entailed. He alluded to a relationship that had been going on since he was a teenager in the late 1960s. David described how they would go on holidays together and book into the same hotel when attending the Dublin Horse Show or when away on business. He alleged that when away, his mother and Father Niall drank heavily together every night. David remarked that the bond and closeness between his mother and Father Niall was stronger than any husband-wife relationship. Articles published about Father Niall's case by Gemma O'Doherty in the Irish Independent newspaper had a wide readership among Irish diaspora abroad. Details of the Irish Independent's investigation into Father Niall's case caught the attention of an Irish American who was both a political scientist and academic researcher. Dr. Kate Flynn is an Irish citizen who grew up in California. She had heard about the death of Father Niall Molloy in 1985 while attending university. Dr. Flynn explained that she had been told by her family that her uncle, Richard Flynn, and his friend, Father Niall Molloy, were involved in an accident which resulted in Father Niall's death. She only became aware of the specifics of the case when the Irish Independent started its own investigation and the SCRT began its review in 2010. On the 19th of January 2013, another article was published in the Irish Independent. Dr. Kate Flynn gave Gemma O'Doherty an interview in which she told Gemma that what she had subsequently learned about the case had shocked her. Dr. Flynn agreed with the recent calls from politicians for a public inquiry. She felt it was too long overdue on the part of the Minister for Justice to grant an independent inquiry into the case. She would state, "Allegations of a high-level cover-up, judicial misconduct, a botched police investigation, and an attempted insurance fraud have compounded my suspicions that someone else, not my uncle, was responsible for Father Niall's killing." Dr. Kate Flynn spent 20 years working in post-conflict regions of the world. As a political scientist, she specialized in bringing about peaceful transitions to democracy in places such as South Africa, Northern Ireland, the former Soviet Union, and the Basque Country. In the course of her work, Dr. Flynn had met many victims of injustice. She saw firsthand the damage concealing the truth could have on victims' families and even on democracy itself. She explained that because of her career, she had taken a professional interest in Father Niall's case. Back in 1982, while a teenager, Kate made a trip to Ireland to visit her Uncle Richard and his family in Kilcoursey House. She described seeing Father Niall once as he walked outside while she hung out of an upstairs window trying to sneak a cigarette. When Father Niall looked up and saw the teenager, he smiled and pretended not to have seen her. She reminisced, "I never actually met him, but on that occasion I was grateful for his apparent discretion. He smiled briefly, then looked away, and as far as I know, told no one. At least not while I was still there. I liked him for that." Dr. Flynn explained that her visit to Kilcoursey House in 1982 was also the first time she would meet her first cousins, David, Maureen, Zandra, and Anita. In September 2012, Dr. Flynn saw the footage of her cousin David giving an ambiguous statement to RTE News outside the courthouse after Father Niall's inquest. Dr. Flynn told Gemma she found her cousin's comments baffling and disturbing and wondered what he meant. She made an appeal for information, but also a direct appeal to David to come forward and disclose everything he knows. According to Gemma O'Doherty's article, the 2-year review by the SCRT appeared to have made no progress. By January of 2013, the SCRT had concluded interviewing witnesses in the review of the original investigation into Father Niall's death. The task of compiling all the information they had gathered into a report was well underway. Once the report was finalised, it would be passed to the Garda Commissioner, Martin Callanan, on the 1st of March 2013. He in turn would pass the report to the office of the DPP to see if any charges should or could be considered. As for making the findings of the report public, that would become a decision for the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, to make. Following on from their calls for an independent inquiry in the Shannon, Labour Party Senators John Whelan and John Kelly organised a presentation to be delivered in Leinster House to cross-party members. They announced that Dr. Kate Flynn would be in attendance to give her support to the campaign for justice for Father Niall. Senator Kelly told John Drennan of the Sunday Independent on the 3rd of March 2013 that Dr. Flynn would attend the presentation to support the Molloys in having the case reopened. Both Senators Kelly and Whelan again called on the government to honour the promise made before they came to power and hold an independent inquiry. Senator Kelly said, "There are still strong ongoing local concerns. This is the case that has never died." While Senator Whelan told the Sunday Independent, there remains considerable public disquiet surrounding this brutal killing. In Leinster House on the 6th of March 2013, Senators Kelly and Whelan addressed a large group of TDs and senators from every political party. Also in attendance were members of Father Niall's family, Dr. Kate Flynn, Gemma O'Doherty, and Father Niall's supporters. The two senators explained, "There is an urgent need for justice, accountability and transparency, as well as much-needed closure for the two families involved, and indeed, the community at large." As well as the two senators, Gemma O'Doherty also gave a presentation of some of the facts surrounding the case. After hearing the presentations, which highlighted issues of concern with the case, over 70 TDs and senators would pledge their support for an independent inquiry. Even political opponents, Micheál Martin, the leader of Fianna Fáil, and Charlie Flanagan, Fine Gael chairman, both vowed to bring up the case with the Justice Minister Alan Shatter. A few days later, the Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, would also come under pressure in the Dáil from independent TD Mattie McGrath. Deputy McGrath called on Enda Kenny to fulfil the pre-election promise made when they were in opposition. He asked the Taoiseach to establish an independent inquiry into the circumstances of Father Niall's death. Deputy McGrath told the Dáil that there was an ongoing scandal involving the priest's unsolved murder. All the evidence points to a high-level cover-up of his death involving all institutions of the state, including elements of the Gardaí, the judiciary, politicians, the health service and the Catholic Church. Deputy McGrath pointed out to the Dáil that the 3 neuropathologists were of the opinion that Father Niall had been left to die for up to 6 hours. He explained Father Niall's watch had stopped at 10:40 and the Gardaí were not contacted until 3:15 a.m. He posed the question, what was happening during these vital hours? Deputy McGrath told the Dáil that the case was fundamental to the pursuit of justice in our country in 2013. The Taoiseach in response said that he would bring the facts raised to the attention of Minister Shatter, who was at that time on a tour of the Middle East. As the 28th anniversary of Father Niall's death approached in July 2013, there was silence from the authorities in relation to the release of the SCRT report and its findings. Calls for an independent inquiry were also still being ignored. Bill Maher and the Molloy family were becoming increasingly angry and frustrated by the delay in the report being released. In August 2013, the DPP would advise the Molloy family that no new charges would be brought in Father Niall's case, because a new investigation had not been undertaken by the SCRT, merely a review of the 1985 investigation. It was no surprise the DPP would decide not to bring any new charges. In an interview with Midlands Radio, Bill Maher explained that his family had a meeting with the Gardaí, who said they had finished their inquiries into issues. They still haven't called it an investigation or anything. They sent a file to the DPP and the DPP came back to them and said that there would be no charges based on the file submitted to them by the Gardaí. However, Bill went on to say that it didn't come as a surprise, to be quite honest. We're happy that the Gardaí involvement in it has come to an end and we're going to press ahead now for a commission of inquiry, which is what we always wanted. Unlike the Gardaí, an independent commission of inquiry can compel witnesses to give evidence under oath. Also, in August 2013, Gemma O'Doherty from the Irish Independent newspaper began to investigate a story from 2 Garda whistleblowers. The whistleblowers had come forward to a group of independent TDs to make allegations of impropriety within An Garda Síochána. They claimed that members of the Gardaí had been quashing penalty points for people of power and privilege. Following up on these claims, at around 10 p.m. one night that August, Gemma O'Doherty called to the home of the Garda Commissioner, Martin Callanan. Gemma wanted to ask the Commissioner about penalty points he had received for speeding, but allegedly had cancelled. Mrs. Callanan answered the door to Gemma as the Commissioner was not at home. Word of Gemma's doorstopping of the Commissioner's wife got back to Gemma's boss, Chief Executive of Irish News Media, Stephen Ray. Gemma was subsequently fired from her position with the Irish Independent and branded a rogue journalist by Mr. Ray. It would later transpire that a driver of a car registered to Mr. Stephen Ray of Irish News Media had received penalty points, but would also have the points cancelled. In November 2012, the leaked conclusion from the SCRT claiming there was no evidence of a cover-up by the institutions of the state would begin the calls for a public, independent inquiry. It would be the last week of October 2013 when the government would eventually provide an answer to those calls. And that answer was no. The DPP felt there were no grounds for any further charges to be brought. The government would adopt the same position as the DPP. The coalition government of Fine Gael and Labour would break their pre-election promise by also deciding there was no grounds for a public inquiry into Father Niall's death. Meanwhile, the SCRT report was still sitting on the Minister for Justice's desk, waiting for his decision on whether to publish it or not. Just before Christmas 2013, after a 9-month delay, Minister Shatter finally announced that he would be appointing Senior Counsel Mr. Dominic McGinn to conduct a review of the SCRT report. This would be far from the independent commission that the Molloy family had hoped for. The remit given to Mr. McGinn was essentially to review the SCRT's report of their review of the original Garda investigation into Father Niall's death. Once Mr. McGinn completed his review, he would compile a report that would be published. The Minister for Justice felt Mr. McGinn's report would be more suitable for public consumption rather than the findings from the SCRT themselves. "2014 would begin with the claims of Garda impropriety from whistleblowers gaining traction. 3 Garda scandals that were about to erupt would bring about the downfall of the most senior Garda in the country and a sitting minister in the government. In February 2014, John Mooney of the Sunday Times claimed that the offices of the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission, or GSOC, had been bugged by persons unknown. GSOC was established in 2005 as an independent statutory body set up to deal with all public complaints in relation to Garda conduct. Its employees, known as commissioners, are not members of the Gardaí. Before 2005, the Gardaí investigated themselves. In recent times, commissioners in GSOC had become suspicious of being spied on. They employed a private British counter-surveillance company called Verimus, who were brought in to conduct a security sweep. Verimus found that emails had been hacked and that the Wi-Fi and phone systems had been compromised. Mr. Mooney, in his article, reported that the sophistication of the surveillance equipment used to bug the offices was of a government-level technology. The bugging of the independent body charged with policing the police would put both the Garda Commissioner, Martin Callanan, and the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, under severe political pressure. But things were about to get worse for these 2 men. An Garda Síochána had been accused of cancelling penalty points at their own discretion for the well-connected. For many, this confirmed that as far as the Gardaí were concerned, who you know, not what you know, was the accepted culture within the force. By March 2014, allegations being made by the 2 Garda whistleblowers would leave Commissioner Callanan in a very precarious position. Commissioner Callanan appeared at the Oireachtas Committee on the allegations being made by Sergeant Maurice McCabe and John Wilson. While addressing the committee, the Garda Commissioner referred to whistleblowers within An Garda Síochána as disgusting. He refused to withdraw that remark. On the 24th of March, it would also emerge that phone calls to and from Garda stations all over the country had been recorded since the early 1980s. The practice continued until November 2013, just 4 months prior. The bugging of GSOC, the quashing of penalty points, and now the recording of phone calls to and from Garda stations left the Garda Commissioner with no choice but to resign the next day. The first female Garda Commissioner to be appointed in the Irish state, Noreen O'Sullivan, would succeed Martin Callanan. After Commissioner Callanan fell on his sword, the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, would be left scrambling to try to save his own political skin. On the 8th of April 2014, Marissa Fagan of the Roscommon Herald reported that Bill Maher, on behalf of the Molloy family, had written to the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter. The Molloys wanted to know if the Gardaí were in possession of any phone recordings relating to the death of Father Niall. Especially of interest to the Molloys would be whether any calls were recorded since the establishment of the SCRT review. Bill Maher told Marissa Fagan, "The recent revelations are of concern, and were seeking clarification if phone calls between family members and their legal representatives and Gardaí were recorded in the aftermath of Father Niall's death, and more recently in our dealings with the cold case unit in Harcourt Street from 2009 onwards. Regardless of when the calls may have been recorded, the Molloy family asked the Minister for Justice to furnish them with all recordings that may have existed since 1985. Bill went on to tell Marissa that they had also asked the Minister for Justice for a meeting to discuss his appointment of senior counsel, Mr. Dominic McGinn, to review the SCRT review. He explained, "We continue to have concerns over the terms of reference for the senior counsel review that has been announced, but have not received any clarification to date. We would also question the sense of priority given to Father Niall's case." By early May 2014, the fallout from the recent Garda scandals would continue. On the 7th of May, the political pressure finally came to bear on the Minister for Justice. The Taoiseach received a report detailing Minister Shatter's poor handling of the allegations made by the Garda whistleblowers. Coupled with the other recent Garda scandals that had emerged, this report would signal the end for Minister Shatter. Alan Shatter was forced to resign as Minister for Justice and Equality as well as Minister for Defence. The next day, the Taoiseach would appoint Francis Fitzgerald as the new Minister for Justice and Equality. The Molloy family would now be dealing with their 12th Minister for Justice since Father Niall was killed. On the 1st of March 2013, the SCRT report had been published, but not publicly. Only senior Gardaí, the DPP and the Minister for Justice were privy to its contents. On the 11th of February 2014, Mr. Dominic McGinn, senior counsel, had been formally appointed by the Minister for Justice to conduct a review of the contents of the SCRT report, which related to the original Garda investigation into the death of Father Niall Molloy. On the 10th of October 2014, what became known as the McGinn Report was completed. It was officially titled Report Following a Review of the Report of the Serious Crime Review Team relating to the Garda investigation into the death of Father Niall Molloy. He began by outlining the terms of reference. Mr. McGinn was ultimately asked to identify any matters of significant public interest or concern that may warrant further inquiry, but only if by using available methods there was still a good chance of being able to establish the truth. The introduction to his report provided a brief synopsis of Father Niall's case and the events that led up to him being appointed by the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter. He would then go on to explain how he had been assigned to review the SCRT report and wanted to clarify that he had not been asked to investigate either Father Niall's death or Richard's trial. He advised that he did not formally interview any witnesses or look to inspect any documents apart from the ones contained in the SCRT report. Mr. McGinn would explain that he took into account rumours and speculations that had been around since 1985. However, he would stress that, "I have not had any regard to the opinions of others in forming my own independent view of the contents of the report." As the rumours and speculations were based on hearsay and were unproven, they would not be admissible in a criminal court. Mr. McGinn warned that unless credible evidence was found to support these rumours or speculation, they should be treated with the utmost caution. In order to summarise the SCRT report, Mr. McGinn explained that he had included as much material that was in the public domain as possible. He also included all the witness statements given to the SCRT which had not been made available to the public. He felt if an inquiry was ever established, they would most likely be released. But for now, the public would have to rely on Mr. McGinn's summaries of these statements. The main body of his report would begin with Father Dignan calling to Sergeant Ford's house at 3:15 a.m. on the morning of the 8th of July, 1985. Mr. McGinn would provide summaries of each event in Father Niall's case in a chronological order, right up to when the SCRT concluded their review. Original witness statements from 1985 or those gathered more recently by the SCRT were summarized and redacted. If something contentious arose, Mr. McGinn would provide his independent view as to its veracity. For each outstanding issue in the case, he would reason as to why it would probably remain outstanding. Before providing his conclusions and recommendations, Mr. McGinn would address the shortcomings in the original Garda investigation as identified by the SCRT. Firstly, he would point out the legal obstacles that stood in the way of the investigation back in 1985. These included not being able to detain and question a suspect in a murder unless a firearm had been used, for which the law had since been changed. Also, the inability of the Gardaí to be able to compel a witness to cooperate, for which legislation had also been passed to remedy. The head of the SCRT, Detective Superintendent Christy Mangan, had made it known that he could not re-examine most of the physical evidence in the case as it had been lost. The original handwritten statements taken from witnesses in 1985 could not be found, so they had to rely on typed copies which still existed. By compiling whatever evidence remained, along with all the newly taken statements, the SCRT formulated findings and conclusions to their review. Their main findings identified what Mr. McGinn would refer to as shortcomings in the original 1985 investigation. These included the Gardaí failing to properly identify and interview all guests who had attended the wedding on July 6th, the failure to conduct routine house-to-house inquiries, no proper investigation of the burglary at Father Niall's home shortly before his death was conducted. It was never ascertained what documents were stolen. The failure to interview people mentioned in David Flynn's original statement earlier to test the veracity of his account. And Father Niall's watch should not have been returned to the Molloy family without a proper investigation of its condition. The SCRT also expressed concern that the Gardaí in 1985 had not sought the opinion at an earlier stage of Dr. Michael Farrell, a consultant neuropathologist. Dr. Harbison had consulted with Dr. Farrell when he examined Father Niall's brain not long after the post-mortem. Dr. Farrell was never asked to provide a report or evidence as to his opinion for Richard Flynn's trial or Father Niall's inquest. Years later, when he was asked to provide his opinion as to how long Father Niall had been left to die, he would state anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. Dr. Farrell's evidence could have completely altered the outcome of Richard's trial. Mr. McGinn, in his report, would concur with each and every failure. Not only that, he would also point out additional failures in the original investigation. He expressed that it would have been of benefit if the Gardaí had questioned Father Dignan more closely as to why he prioritized going home to get his glasses rather than contact a doctor or the Gardaí. He would describe the absence of a statement from the solicitor in Farron Murthas in relation to the business transactions for Teresa and Father Niall as a significant omission. And he would point out that there was complete absence of any record of any forensic testing on pieces of evidence or samples taken from Kilcoursey House. To finalize his report, Mr. McGinn would present a lengthy commentary on the case. Then it would be followed by his conclusions and recommendations. In his commentary, he would address the unusual, if not unique, features about the case one by one. Up until the SCRT review, the 8-foot-long bloody drag mark on the carpet remained an unexplained feature of the case. On interviewing David Flynn and Liam Lycett, the SCRT would establish that Richard had admitted to dragging Father Niall's body across the bedroom floor, but then gave up. As for the rest of the unusual or unique features of the case, Mr. McGinn would provide his rationale as to why these features would probably remain unresolved. He would get straight to the point by asserting that while many of these features are quite disturbing and merited an in-depth analysis, unfortunately, it appears to me that the precise truth of the events of the 7th and 8th of July 1985 cannot now be ascertained. The first feature to be addressed would be the time Father Niall was attacked. Mr. McGinn would accept the medical evidence suggesting Father Niall had lived anywhere from 3 hours up to 24 hours after being injured. By taking this into consideration, along with sightings of Father Niall by independent witnesses, he felt it was most probable Father Niall was attacked sometime between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. on Sunday, the 7th of July. By suggesting this 2-hour window, Mr. McGinn did not accept the accounts provided by Richard and Teresa regarding the timings that night. Even if the time of the assault could be determined, he would remind the reader that it still does not provide any answers as to what happened during those hours. Addressing Father Niall's watch being stopped at 10:40, Mr. McGinn would point out that some people found this to be significant, while he would deem the situation to be less clear-cut. He explained that based on a close analysis of the evidence, there were a number of ambiguous issues with the watch. He would state, the first, most obvious observation is that it cannot now be established that Father Molloy's watch was even showing the correct time on the 7th of July 1985. Mr. McGinn would take the word of the Technical Bureau Gardaí, who claimed that during the post-mortem the watch was only superficially damaged and still in working order. He pointed to a local Garda who did not agree with the Dublin Gardaí's assessment that the watch was working, but in his additional statement given in 1986, he apparently had not noticed whether the watch was working or not. Mr. McGinn did not touch upon the fact that there was no mention of Father Niall's watch in any of the original statements given by the Technical Bureau or local Gardaí in 1985. Suggestions that the damage to the watch could only have been caused by excessive force were then addressed. Mr. McGinn would point out that evidence from the watchmaker who repaired it felt the damage could have been caused by a relatively modest impact, contradicting both Tom Reddy's article and a report from Detective Inspector Jerry O'Carroll. While Mr. McGinn would accept that the medical evidence suggested Father Niall may have been injured at 10:40 on the evening of the 7th of July 1985, he felt the contradictions surrounding the watch did not conclusively prove this. He would go on to state that regardless of the specific timing of the assault on Father Niall and his subsequent death, what also remained unclear was why there was a substantial delay in contacting the authorities. He felt a lot of speculation and theories had been proposed to fill in for the lack of evidence. However, many of these speculations were baseless, and some of the theories were actually contradicted by the existing evidence, according to Mr. McGinn. He would allude to the comments Father Dignan made to Sergeant Ford when he asked if Father Niall's death could be kept quiet, as being at best inappropriate. But because Father Dignan is now dead, there is no way to establish what his motivation was for making those remarks. Richard's calm demeanour when the Gardaí arrived on scene was considered noticeable, but Mr. McGinn stated, in the absence of any explanation by Richard Flynn, any conclusion drawn from his behaviour would simply be speculative. He found that the Flynn family's attitude towards the authorities was somewhat to be expected, considering that at least one of them likely knew who was responsible for Father Niall's death. He pointed out that if the Flynn family members decided not to provide any additional information or claim to have forgotten the details of that night, there are limited legal options available to persuade them otherwise. Mr. McGinn also stressed that it is important to note that individuals have the right not to self-incriminate. On the other hand, he stated that if someone admits to committing an illegal act, their confession is generally taken as highly credible, since it is rare for individuals to confess to crimes they didn't actually commit. The Flynns, withholding details of the business dealings with Father Niall, would be next to be addressed. Mr. McGinn felt it suspicious that the ongoing business transactions between the Flynn family and Father Niall were not disclosed to the authorities when the Gardaí investigation started and only became known later. The most reasonable conclusion you would draw from this is that Richard and Teresa purposely withheld this information, as it would have suggested that they could have gained a financial benefit from Father Niall's death. While this inference may seem apparent, Mr. McGinn pointed out that there are other reasons why someone might withhold information. Therefore, he felt it would be wrong to arrive at a concrete conclusion in this regard. Richard's trial in 1986 was so controversial, its outcome and Justice Rowe's possible connection to the Flynn family had to be addressed. Mr. McGinn would indicate that in light of the confession made on a number of occasions by Richard Flynn to inflicting the violence on Father Niall Molloy, the direct acquittal of Richard Flynn at his trial was extraordinary. While most of the criticism had been directed at Justice Rowe, Mr. McGinn found that a thorough examination of the evaluation regarding the trial evidence suggested that the outcome may have been influenced, at least in part, by the concessions made by Dr. Harbison during cross-examination. At the time of compiling his report, Mr. McGinn did not have available to him the written ruling by Judge Rowe, and since the judge was now dead, Mr. McGinn felt it would be impossible to determine the precise reasons for the judge's decision. He would go on to describe Judge Frank Rowe being deeply involved in the horse business as an uncomfortable fact. Because this was something the judge had in common with Richard, Teresa, and Father Niall, Mr. McGinn stated that this inevitably had led to an inference being drawn that he must have known all the parties involved, and that accordingly he was predisposed towards ensuring that Richard Flynn would not be convicted. No proof had been found of any letters being sent by Judge Rowe to the DPP. As there was no documentary evidence to substantiate any allegations, Mr. McGinn again concluded that as the judge was now deceased, it is unlikely that any concrete conclusions founded on reliable evidence could be reached. Next, Mr. McGinn would acknowledge that the evidence showed that the Flynn family had friendships with people involved in politics, some of them at the highest level. But again, he found no proof to support claims that these political connections had been used to benefit the Flynns in relation to the circumstances surrounding Father Niall's death. Mr. McGinn would accept it was an undeniable fact Father Niall's file had been stolen from the office of the DPP in August 1987. However, he would emphasize that many files had been stolen during the break-in and there was no evidence to suggest Father Niall's file had been specifically targeted. In relation to any comments or opinions the thief may have shared with family or associates about the contents of the file, Mr. McGinn found there was no evidence to substantiate these utterings. Without addressing reports of the file being used to blackmail the Gardaí, Mr. McGinn reassuringly advised that the reality is that the file was eventually recovered and that it is now available for perusal. While he would accept that the theft of the file had fueled speculation about the case, he would conclude the actual consequences of the theft appear to be less dramatic. Also dismissed would be any suggestion that the fire at the coroner's office was in any way connected to Father Niall's case. Mr. McGinn would state that the coroner's file escaped being damaged, but the Irish Independent reported differently in 2010. The newspaper claimed that when they contacted the coroner, Mr. Mahon, he admitted the file had been destroyed. However, Mr. McGinn, at the outset, stated he would not refer to any documents other than those included in the SCRT report. As a result, he would not have known that the coroner had admitted to the Irish Independent that the file had been destroyed in the fire. Next, Mr. McGinn would afford a huge amount of conjecture to the anonymous letters received by the Molloys. He would explain that unnamed sources of information usually pose a challenge because they cannot be questioned or tested to determine their reliability, accuracy, or truthfulness. In Father Niall's case, Mr. McGinn felt certain claims made in the letters had proven to be unreliable, while others have suffered from a lack of corroborative evidence. The amount of rumours, gossip and speculation would be described by Mr. McGinn as significant, but perhaps to be expected given the shortcomings in the 1985 Garda investigation, the lack of credible explanation of events at Kilcoursey House, and the outcome of the criminal trial. He would advise that much of the SCRT's attention had focused on trying to verify or gather evidence to prove any of the rumours, but according to Mr. McGinn, this inevitably revealed an absence of evidence to substantiate what had been asserted. Mr. McGinn would accept that there was objective evidence that Teresa Flynn had attempted to claim the life insurance policy on Father Niall. He would note that Father Niall had signed the policy and Teresa was detailed as his sister or next of kin. He would also note that the claim was not pursued any further when additional documents were requested by the insurance company. However, Mr. McGinn would point out that as Teresa Flynn is also dead, it would be impossible for any further light to be shed on this aspect of the case. In addressing the existence of Father Niall's will, Mr. McGinn would state, although suggestions were made that a will had been entrusted to the church, the available evidence shows that, in fact, there is no record whatsoever of any such document ever having been made. The last feature of the case to be addressed as part of Mr. McGinn's commentary would be the extent and location of Father Niall's property. He advised that after Father Niall's death, there were concerns regarding a racehorse and several paintings he had owned. Mr. McGinn suggested that these concerns appeared to have been dealt with shortly after Father Niall's death, likely during the civil cases against the Flynns brought by the Molloys. In truth, only the civil case in which Richard Flynn was held responsible for Father Niall's death had been settled. Mr. McGinn would conclude his 109-page report by expressing that due to a considerable amount of time passing between the events of the 7th of July 1985 and the reopening of the case by the SCRT, it was not surprising that numerous questions from the original investigation remain unanswered. He would point out that the situation had been made more challenging because those who possess first-hand knowledge of the events have been reluctant to answer questions. Mr. McGinn would note that it would appear that this difficulty cannot be overcome, while reminding readers that individuals have a right not to self-incriminate. Mr. McGinn would emphasize that it can never be forgotten or ignored that this case stems from the tragic and unnecessary loss of the life of a relatively young man who was much loved by his family and those in the wider community. Whenever a life is prematurely cut short by a human act, there is an understandable and justified quest for answers and answerability. Following the death of Father Niall Molloy, such a quest has been frustrated by a number of different factors, all of which have accumulated to give rise to a completely reasonable sense of injustice. Despite this reasonable sense of injustice, Mr. McGinn would remind the reader that he had been tasked with identifying any issues of public interest or concern which would warrant further inquiry, but only if such further inquiry would have a reasonable prospect of establishing the truth. He would reaffirm that the main aim of his report was to address as many issues as possible in order to reduce the number of unanswered questions in the case. Mr. McGinn would conclude by stating, "It is difficult to envisage how any further inquiry could have a reasonable prospect of establishing the truth about the issues raised, whether or not these are of significant public interest." Mr. McGinn's final recommendation would be very brief. While he would point out that issues of public interest had been identified as per the terms of reference set down, he did not feel that any further inquiry would have a reasonable prospect of establishing the truth. Accordingly, examination by further inquiry could not be said to be warranted. Alan Shatter had resigned as Minister for Justice just a few months after appointing Mr. McGinn to conduct his review. The next Minister for Justice, Francis Fitzgerald, would inherit Mr. McGinn's report when it was completed on the 10th of October 2014. However, Minister Fitzgerald would not release the report to the public until the 31st of March 2015. The Department of Justice would issue a statement in conjunction with the public release of the McGinn report on the 31st of March 2015. The press release would explain the review undertaken by the SCRT, Mr. McGinn being appointed, and the purpose of his review. It would also advise that in order to facilitate the publication of the report and following consultation with the Attorney General, the names of witnesses not in the public domain were redacted. Minister Fitzgerald's statement began by paraphrasing the sentiments Mr. McGinn gave in the conclusion of his report. She acknowledged that this case involves the tragic death of Father Niall Molloy, a man much loved by his friends and by those in the community. She accepted that there had been concerns expressed regarding this case for many years, and that the decision by the DPP not to bring any new charges must have come as a disappointment to Father Molloy's family. However, the minister would emphasize that the DPP must proceed on the basis of evidence and the law, notwithstanding the strength of feelings which exist regarding a case. She would go on to state, "As minister, I have no role in the prosecution process, but I am of course very aware of the claims which have been made about Father Molloy's death over many years." She would go on to explain that because of concerns raised in the case, Mr. McGinn was appointed to independently assess what information could go into the public domain and to advise as to whether further inquiry would be warranted. Minister Fitzgerald would describe Mr. McGinn's appointment in the first place as an exceptional course of action, motivated by the desire to bring the greatest possible transparency to bear. The minister would exalt the important service the report served by providing considerable detail and background to the case, all of which would now be in the public domain. She would point out that while some issues were clarified, some of the concerns expressed were simply not supported by evidence. But the report did set out the shortcomings in the original investigation which had been identified by the SCRT review. Minister Fitzgerald would concede that Mr. McGinn's report did not answer all of the questions that had been raised. She would, however, accept that Mr. McGinn's conclusion that the events surrounding Father Niall's death cannot now be ascertained, and as such, examination by a further inquiry would not be warranted. While she appreciated this would come as a disappointment to Father Niall's family, she hoped they would accept the decision because every effort had been made to answer as many questions as possible. The minister would sympathize with Father Niall's family and other families who had lost loved ones in violent circumstances. She acknowledged the grief felt is greatly compounded by not knowing exactly what happened and no one being held to account. In conclusion, Minister Fitzgerald would state, "Ultimately, however, I have to determine whether further inquiry would be warranted in the public interest and would have some prospect of success. In this instance, based on the work of the SCRT and Mr. McGinn's careful analysis, I must conclude that it would not." An article published in the Irish Independent on the 1st of April 2015 by Tom Brady would look to Father Niall's family for their reaction to the decision that no further inquiry is warranted. Father Molloy's nephew, Bill Maher, would state, "We're deeply disappointed that an inquiry has been ruled out. As far as the family is concerned, it doesn't stop here. If we can, and if we have to, we will go to Europe if we have to go down that road." Mr. Brady would point out in his article that the report set out some shortcomings in the original Garda investigation, while also acknowledging the precise events surrounding the priest's death could not now be ascertained. The Molloys would write to the Minister for Justice requesting a meeting. Garda Commissioner Noreen O'Sullivan also released a statement hoping the report would bring some comfort to Father Niall's family. In relation to any criticisms of the SCRT review, she felt that it appeared that some of their work had been vindicated, but at the same time, she took no comfort from that. The Commissioner went on to state that if anyone had any new information on the death of Father Molloy, they could come forward with it, but she said she did not think it was right to hold out hope 30 years later that new evidence was likely to establish anything new. In response to this statement, Bill Maher, on behalf of Father Niall's family, wrote to Commissioner O'Sullivan. 6th of April 2015, "Dear Commissioner O'Sullivan, I have read and reread your statement last week following the release of the McGinn report. I am at a total loss to try to understand it or get any real sense from it. Can you explain how you think the McGinn report would, quote, bring some comfort to Father Molloy's family, as has been widely reported? Can you explain why at the final briefing with the SCRT we were assured that they were recommending a commission of investigation in their report as the only way to establish the facts? Yet there was no reference to that in the McGinn report. Was it airbrushed out? I know for a fact that Christy Mangan's secretary was seen typing up the Molloy file again some months after the final report had been submitted to Mr. Callanan, the previous Garda Commissioner. Was it returned to Mr. Mangan's office for alterations, as had been suggested to me? My family would also be very anxious to hear your observations on a section of the report titled Shortcomings in the 1985 Investigation, People Not Questioned, Forensic Evidence Not Properly Examined, etc. As for vindicating the work of the review team, I am glad you had the foresight to add some of the work. I first made contact with a detective from the team in January 2009 when I approached the team with concerns regarding two murders, my uncle Father Niall Molloy in 1985 and a close friend, Charles Self, in 1972. My family was unimpressed by their work right from the start. In my uncle's case, they tried to fob me off quite early on by laying the blame solely on Judge Rowe. No mention at any stage of an incompetent Garda investigation in 1985, which seems to be the conclusion in Mr. McGinn's report. In fact, their whole approach was casual, not very professional, and it was pressure from the Dáil that made them go back and interview people for a second time and take statements on their second visit. A waste of time and resources, I'm sure you will agree. I look forward to hearing from you. Bill Maher. 4 days later, on the 10th of April 2015, Dear Commissioner, I still have not had the courtesy of a reply to my email sent to you last Monday. Could you please explain your statement last week where you hoped the McGinn report would bring, quote, some comfort to the family? My family were distressed by your comments, which were widely reported in the media. We were told that your appointment would mean changes in the Gardaí. Mr. Callanan also failed to answer letters. It's simply not good enough. You, as Commissioner, made the statement, either justify it or make a public apology to the Molloy family. My family have had enough to deal with over the past 30 years. We do not need this. Regards, Bill Maher. A Roscommon Herald article published on the 28th of April 2015 reported that the Garda Commissioner has declined to comment on shortcomings in the 1985 investigation into the death of Father Niall, as well as confirming that no further action would be taken in relation to the shortcomings. A spokesperson for the Commissioner would also advise that the Commissioner has no further comment on this matter. Because no further action was taken by the Gardaí in relation to the shambles of an investigation in 1985, it was reported that the Molloy family angrily believed the Garda Commissioner should stand down. In July 2015, around the time of the 30th anniversary of Father Niall's death, Bill and members of the Molloys would be granted an audience with the Minister for Justice, Francis Fitzgerald. For over an hour, Father Niall's family spoke with the minister about the case. When they were leaving, the Molloys gave Minister Fitzgerald a file they had compiled and photographs of the crime scene and Father Niall's badly injured body. The minister would describe the photographs as distressing. She promised the Molloys she would respond to them after summer recess. The Molloys would follow up with regular letters, which all remained unanswered. The Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, would ask President Michael D. Higgins to dissolve the Dáil on the 3rd of February 2016. On the 26th of February, a general election was held. As Fine Gael did not win enough seats to form a majority government, Mr. Kenny resigned, but he and his cabinet remained on as a caretaker government until the end of April. When a Fine Gael minority coalition was agreed with Fianna Fáil, Mr. Kenny was re-elected Taoiseach on the 6th of May 2016. The same day, Francis Fitzgerald was reappointed as Minister for Justice and Equality and also promoted to the position of Taoiseach. Now that the original Garda investigation had officially been deemed shambolic, only the Molloys were asking the question, why? Why there were such failures to follow basic Garda procedures back in 1985. Approaching the 31st anniversary of Father Niall's death in June 2016, the Molloy family, angered and frustrated with the lack of response by the government, decided to pursue one further avenue of investigation open to them. Henry McCourt, a nephew of Father Niall and cousin of Bill Maher, formally lodged a complaint with the Garda Síochána Ombudsman Commission, or GSOC. On the 9th of June 2016, GSOC would admit Henry's complaint for investigation. According to Henry's complaint, the SCRT and the McGinn reports had uncovered serious deficiencies in the Garda investigation into his uncle's death, and this prompted him to bring the matter to GSOC's attention. Henry alleged that these serious deficiencies gave rise to him making the complaint, which related to the shambolic, unprofessional and unacceptable investigation into the death of his uncle. He would state in his complaint that while he was of the view Mr. McGinn, senior counsel, recommended no further inquiry into Father Niall's death, this does not mean that the conduct of the Garda investigation and the performance of those Garda members involved could or should not be investigated further. It would take a further 2 years for GSOC to investigate before they would publish their report in July 2018. From this point onward, The government will use Mr. McGinn's recommendations to dismiss any calls for an independent commission of investigation. Yet again, the Molloys' hopes of getting justice for Father Niall are dashed. Despite this, they are not willing to give up. In Episode 8, GSOC concludes their 2-year investigation into the Molloys' complaint. A 2-part documentary for television with an accompanying book and a primetime investigates program reignites interest in the case. This series was written, produced and edited by Liv Kerwin. Narrated by Marcus Kerwin. Music, Take Up Your Cross by Onchenko Music. We would like to extend our very special thanks to Mr. Bill Maher and Father Niall's family. This series is dedicated to the memory of Joe, Matthew and Tony. This has been a Kurska production.